Admiral Sarah Voss had spent 31 years in service to the Terran Galactic Authority, and in all that time she had never once questioned why the Vale Empire kept sending its best diplomats to human space. She stood at the viewport of TGA Command Station Helios, watching a Vale shuttle glide toward the docking ring with the practiced elegance that characterized everything their species did. Their ships moved like thoughts. Precise. Unhurried. Inevitable. Ambassador Kael'thris has requested a private audience, said her aide, Lieutenant Commander Haruto Nishida, without looking up from his tablet. She says it is regarding the Frontier Compact renewal. Voss did not respond immediately. She watched the shuttle dock. She had met Kael'thris 4 times before. The Vale ambassador was tall even by her species standards, her exoskeletal plating a deep amber that shifted toward gold in direct light. She spoke 7 human languages without accent. She had a habit of tilting her head slightly to the left whenever she asked a question she already knew the answer to. Voss had noticed that habit on their second meeting and never mentioned it. "Tell her I'll be in the Amber Room in 20 minutes, Voss said at last. The Terran Galactic Authority had not always been the dominant force in the known galaxy. 40 years ago, humanity had been a young, fractious, and frequently embarrassing presence on the galactic stage. 2 wars with the Karathi, a failed colonization of the Reach Nebula, and a series of trade agreements that had left 3 independent human factions nearly bankrupt. History was not kind to the early TGA. Then something changed. Not in a flash. Not with a single decisive moment. The change came slowly, the way tides reshape coastlines. Suddenly, human negotiators were winning deals that should have gone the other way. Suddenly, Karathi aggression stopped at borders that had previously been indefensible. Suddenly, TGA resource surveys were finding mineral deposits that older, more experienced civilizations had somehow missed for centuries. The humans credited themselves as humans always do. They called it the resurgence. They built monuments to their own resilience. Schoolchildren across 200 colonies learned that humanity had simply refused to fail, that willpower and ingenuity had turned the tide. Voss had believed it too once. She was 43 years old when she first began to suspect otherwise. It had happened during a debrief following the 7th Keth Accords. Voss, then a senior strategic officer, had been reviewing the final negotiation transcripts when she noticed something small. Almost nothing. A phrase used by the TGA's lead negotiator, Ambassador Dreen Falk, in the closing session. A phrase about resource redistribution timelines that was, in isolation, perfectly ordinary. Except Voss had been present 3 days earlier when Ambassador Kael'thris, in a supposedly casual conversation about Vale agricultural policy, had used the exact same phrase. The same structure. The same conceptual framing. The kind of specificity that was not coincidence. She had filed it away. Said nothing. Watched. Now, in the Amber Room, Kael'thris sat across from her with that characteristic stillness that Voss had come to understand was not passivity. It was the stillness of something that did not need to move to have power. "The Frontier Compact," Voss said, sitting down with her own coffee. She had poured nothing for Kael'thris, who never ate or drank in human company. "You've come a long way to discuss renewal terms that haven't changed substantially in 12 years. Kael'thris tilted her head to the left. "The terms may need to reflect new realities," the ambassador said. Her voice was a low contralto that many humans found unexpectedly reassuring. "The Karathi have repositioned 3 fleets along the Keth border. You'll see the intelligence reports within the week. We thought it prudent to speak before the formal channels become crowded with noise." "You thought it prudent?" Voss repeated. Not a question. "Yes." Voss looked at her for a long moment. Outside the stars held still. "Ambassador," she said carefully, "how long have the Vale been watching us?" Something shifted in Kael'thris's expression. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have registered on any standard emotional recognition system. Just the faintest reorganization of the muscles around her secondary eyes. "That is a very specific question, Admiral," Kael'thris said, "for a very general answer." "Then give me the general answer." The ambassador was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Voss counted. "Long enough," Kael'thris said, "to know that you are ready to ask better ones." Voss went home that night and pulled every intelligence file on Vale diplomatic activity going back 60 years. She did not sleep. By morning, she had 17 pages of notes and a feeling in her chest that she had not experienced since she was a child, discovering that the world was larger and stranger than anyone had told her. She was right that something was wrong with the story humanity told about its own rise. She was wrong in ways she could not yet imagine, about how wrong she was. The TGA Historical Archive on Luna was the largest single repository of human documentary history in existence. It held everything: birth records, fleet manifests, economic ledgers from the earliest colony ships, classified intelligence assessments going back to the founding of the authority. Voss had accessed it hundreds of times in her career. She had never, until now, been looking for something she expected to find. She worked through official channels because she was not yet ready to work around them. She submitted a research request under the pretext of preparing a strategic assessment of Veil-Terran relations for the compact renewal. The archive systems returned 347 files flagged as relevant. She sorted them chronologically and began at the beginning. The early records were what she expected: stilted diplomatic correspondence, trade grievances, the kind of bureaucratic language that politely conceals hostility. The Veil had been present at the periphery of humanity's early expansion, one of a dozen spacefaring civilizations that watched the newcomers with varying degrees of patience. Then she hit year 12 of the TGA's existence and found the first anomaly. It was a footnote. In a report about mineral extraction rights in the Outer Keth territories, there was a passing reference to a Veil survey team that had, according to the document, generously provided locational data regarding confirmed subsurface deposits. The report praised the gesture as an example of developing interspecies goodwill. It was the word generously that caught her. Not shared. Not provided as part of an exchange. Generously. A word that implied one party giving and the other receiving with nothing offered in return. Voss made a note and kept reading. She found 9 more such references in the following 3 hours. Each one small. Each one in isolation unremarkable. A Veil navigator who happened to be nearby when a TGA exploration vessel suffered a guidance system failure and needed routing assistance. A Veil trade consultant who offered analysis of Karathi economic pressure points, analysis that the TGA used to devastating effect in subsequent negotiations. A Veil medical team that arrived at a struggling outer colony 6 days before a crop pathogen reached critical spread levels, bringing treatment compounds that were not yet in TGA medical databases. Each instance taken alone could be explained. The Veil were advanced. They were allies. They helped. But Voss had spent 31 years in strategic operations. She understood the difference between help and investment. She called in a favor with an old colleague at the Office of Intelligence Analysis. Dr. Marin Chu was 62, semi-retired, and had spent most of her career doing exactly the kind of pattern work that Voss needed now. They met for lunch in a small restaurant near the archive complex. Voss passed her a data chip. "I need you to look at something," Voss said. Quietly. Chu looked at the chip, then at Voss. Quietly meaning no documentation? Quietly meaning I'm probably wrong and I'd rather be quietly wrong than loudly wrong. Chu took the chip. She was back in 48 hours. They met again in the same restaurant. Chu ordered tea and looked out the window at the gray Luna sky for a long moment before speaking. "You're not wrong," Chu said. Voss set down her fork. "The pattern is consistent across the full 70-year record," Chu continued. "Veil interventions at critical junctures. Resource provision. Intelligence sharing. Diplomatic positioning. All of it subtly directed toward outcomes that benefited the TGA." She paused. "Specifically, outcomes that benefited TGA expansion and stability. Not Veil expansion. Not the broader galactic balance. TGA specifically. Why would they do that?" Chu smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "That's the interesting question, isn't it?" She turned the chip over in her fingers. "I pulled the Veil's own public strategic documents. The ones available to allied species. They're long-range stability models. The Veil have been tracking something called a Galactic Threat Index for about 300 years. A predictive model for civilizational collapse events. Wars that could destabilize multiple species simultaneously. And their models show that the greatest instability risk in this sector over the next 200 years comes not from any existing conflict. It comes from a power vacuum." Chu set the chip on the table. "They've been watching the older civilizations decline. The Karathi are contracting. The Meridian Collective fell apart 30 years ago. The Veil themselves have maintained stability, but they're not expanding." She met Voss's eyes. Something needed to rise. Something durable. Something with the particular characteristics that made long-term stability possible. Voss stared at her. "They picked us." "They didn't just pick you," Chu said carefully. "They cultivated you. There's a difference. And it started before most of the people doing it were born." Voss sat with that for a long time. Outside, a transport passed over the dome, its running lights blinking steadily in the dark. How many people know? She asked finally. Impossible to say, she replied. But I'd guess very few humans. She hesitated. And at least one of them is someone you've already spoken to. Voss requested a second meeting with Kael'thas. Formally, through official channels, which meant she had to wait 11 days for a slot in the ambassador's schedule. 11 days in which she said nothing to anyone, continued her normal duties, and woke every morning at 3 in the morning with her mind already running. She read everything she could find about the Veil. They were, officially, the galaxy's oldest continuously spacefaring civilization. Estimates ranged from 4,000 to 6,000 years of recorded interstellar history. They had survived 3 major conflicts, 2 of which had brought their population to near collapse, and had emerged from each one with what their scholars described as a recalibrated philosophical framework. They did not call it wisdom in their own language. The closest translation was something like, the knowledge that outlives its teachers. Their biology was remarkable. The Veil were not a hive mind in any simple sense, but they shared what xenobiologists called a resonance network, a form of low-bandwidth biological communication that allowed emotional and conceptual states to propagate through proximity over time. It was not telepathy. It was closer to the way moods moved through a human crowd, but with greater fidelity and range. It meant that Veil communities developed an unusual degree of long-term coherence. Decisions made with the understanding that their emotional consequences would be felt by everyone around you created a civilizational culture that was genuinely oriented toward long-term thinking. Not in the way humans claim to be. Actually, a Veil political leader could not simply abstract the suffering of distant others. They would feel the echoes of it. Not with the immediacy of personal pain, but with the steady, persistent quality of a sound that never entirely left the room. Voss thought about that every day for 11 days. She met Kael'thas in the amber room again. Different afternoon. The same chair. The same stillness. I've been doing research, Voss said, dispensing with any preliminary. I suspected you would, Kael'thas replied. The word, suspected, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The ambassador's secondary eyes moved slightly. Yes, she said. It is. Voss folded her hands on the table. I want to understand something. Not officially. Not in any capacity that will end up in a report. I want to understand it as one individual who has spent her life in service asking another individual who has apparently spent considerably longer in a similar endeavor. She paused. Why did it matter that we succeeded? There were other species rising at the same time. The Karath were expanding. The Sindari had just achieved interstellar capability. Why us? Kael'thas was quiet for longer this time. 6 seconds. You are asking whether you were chosen, the ambassador said, or whether you simply happened to be in the right place. Both. Neither. I'm asking what you saw. Kael'thas set her four-fingered hands on the table. What we saw, she said slowly, was a species that had developed, through accident or evolution or some combination we have not fully mapped, a particular capacity. Not for war. Not for technology. Many species have those. She paused again. What your species has, Admiral, is a capacity for absorbing catastrophic loss and maintaining the will to continue. Not just biologically. Culturally. Institutionally. Human civilizations collapse and the next generation rebuilds. Human individuals lose everything and find reasons to continue. This is not universal. Many species, when they encounter extinction-level pressure, fragment. The social bonds that held them dissolve under sufficient stress. She met Voss's eyes directly. Yours do not. We studied 400 years of your pre-spaceflight history before we made any formal contact. Every century contained events that, by our models, should have produced civilizational collapse. Pandemics. Total wars. Environmental crises. Economic failures that left hundreds of millions in destitution. She tilted her head. Each time human civilization survived. Often damaged. Often brutally diminished. But present. Still there. Still rebuilding. Voss said nothing. We are not young, Admiral. We have watched many species rise and fall. We have not always had the opportunity or the will to intervene. With your species, we saw something that appeared in our long-range models as a genuine stabilizing variable. A civilization that, if it reached sufficient scale and integration with galactic systems, might serve as an anchor against the kinds of cascade failures we have seen before. Kael'thas's voice remained level. We chose to invest. You chose to secretly manage us, Voss said. Not with anger. With precision. We chose to provide favorable conditions, Kael'thas said. The choices were always yours. We never forced an outcome. We positioned. We suggested. We ensured that when critical decisions were made, the information available was complete. That's a meaningful distinction only if the people receiving the help know they're receiving it. Kael'thas said nothing. It was, Voss recognized, the ambassador's version of an acknowledgement. How long were you going to keep it quiet? Voss asked. Until you were ready to know, Kael'thas said. We believed that would take approximately this long. The faintest suggestion of something warm entered her expression. We were watching for someone who would ask the right questions in the right order without needing to be told that the questions were worth asking. Voss stared at her. You've been waiting for me specifically? Not you specifically, Kael'thas said. Someone like you. Someone who would know what to do with the answer. She tilted her head left. Do you? Voss did not answer Kael'thas's question that day. She asked for access to the Vale's historical records. Specifically, the records of other civilizations that they had watched rise and fall. The ones that had not been cultivated. The ones that had collapsed without intervention. Kael'thas arranged it. It took another 3 weeks. The data came through a secure Vale diplomatic channel, tagged as cultural exchange material for TGA strategic planning purposes. On paper it was unremarkable. In practice, it was the most disorienting thing Voss had ever read. She worked through it in her private quarters over the course of 10 days. She requested no assistance. She told no one what she was reviewing. She slept poorly and ate mechanically and came to understand, slowly and with a growing weight in her chest, exactly what the Vale had been trying to prevent. The Meridian Collective had been the most technologically sophisticated civilization in the sector for 1100 years. They had developed faster-than-light communication. They had cracked cold fusion in a form that remained theoretical for every other species. Their art and philosophy had influenced 400 years of galactic cultural development. They had collapsed in 60 years. Not from war. Not from plague. From a feedback loop of internal fragmentation driven by political short-termism and a gradual erosion of the shared institutions that had held them together. Species that did not have the human capacity for resilience under catastrophic stress had found that once the social fabric began fraying, it did not stop. What would have been a crisis of decades for a human civilization had been, for the Meridians, a terminal event. The Karathi civil schism of 2 centuries ago had taken 900 million lives and left 3 formerly thriving systems entirely depopulated. The cause had been a resource dispute that escalated beyond any rational containment. The Vale had attempted limited intervention. It had not been enough, because they had started too late and without the trust architecture that effective intervention required. The Keth ascendancy had destroyed itself from within in less than a generation after reaching galactic prominence. A combination of technological overextension and a failure to develop ethical frameworks that kept pace with capability. They had built weapons that no political structure could responsibly control and used them accordingly. Voss read each case study. She read the Vale analyst's notes. She read the cold, careful language of beings who had watched this happen before and developed, out of grief and out of practicality, a methodology for trying to prevent it from happening again. The methodology was imperfect. It was ethically compromised in the way that all paternalism is compromised. The Vale knew this. They said so in their own records with a directness that Voss had not expected. We are aware, wrote a Vale strategist named Ethi Keln, in a document dated approximately 40 years ago, that our interventions in the development of young civilizations constitute a form of violation. We act without consent. We shape outcomes that those we assist believe are their own. This is not ethically simple. We have debated it for 300 years. What we have concluded, imperfectly and with ongoing reservation, is that the alternative, which is to watch capable civilizations destroy themselves or be destroyed when timely assistance would have preserved them, is itself an ethical choice. We choose to act. We accept responsibility for that choice. We do not pretend that it is clean. Voss read that passage 3 times. She thought about all the human children who had grown up being told that humanity had pulled itself up through its own determination. She thought about the monument on New Geneva, the great bronze figure with its arm raised toward the stars, inscribed with the words, "By our own hand we reached the sky." She thought about what it meant that the story was partially false. And she thought about what it meant that a civilization of beings who could have let humanity struggle and fail had instead spent a century quietly making sure the tools were in place, the information was available, the worst catastrophes were survivable. It did not simplify into anger. She wanted it to. Anger was cleaner. Instead she felt something more complicated. Something that contained gratitude and resentment and respect and a deep, grieving sensed that the universe was older and more watchful than she had known, and that the galaxy her species had entered with such confidence was an ancient place with ancient sorrows, and that the Veil had looked at humanity and decided, for reasons they had now explained, that the sorrow did not need to multiply. On the 11th day she wrote a single message to Kael'thas. It contained 3 words, "I understand why." Then she wrote 4 more, "Now we need to talk." The meeting that followed was not held in the Amber Room. Voss arranged it on neutral ground, which in practical terms meant a mid-range conference facility on the TGA's diplomatic station at Keth 7. No recording systems. No aides. She brought one person, Dr. Marin Chu, who had earned her place in this conversation and whose pattern analysis skills were going to be necessary for what Voss intended. Kael'thas brought a single companion as well. A younger Veil named Sothris, who was introduced as a strategic analyst and who sat through the entire meeting with the focused stillness of someone taking notes in their head. Voss opened without preamble. "I'm not here to expose you," she said. "I want that on the table from the start. I've read the records. I understand what you were trying to prevent. I understand that what you did was not simple manipulation for Veil benefit. I understand the framework." She looked at Kael'thas steadily. "I also believe that the framework has to change." "Tell me how," Kael'thas said. "You've been operating in secret because you concluded we weren't ready to know. I'm telling you that a relationship built on managed information is a relationship with a structural failure point. The moment it comes out through channels you don't control, which it will, you lose everything you built." Voss leaned forward slightly. "Every gain the TGA made with Veil support gets reframed as Veil interference. The resurgence narrative collapses. Political factions that already distrust galactic integration will have exactly the evidence they need." She paused. "You will have raised us to galactic prominence and then handed our most destructive elements a weapon to tear it down with." Chu spoke for the first time. "We ran the disclosure models. The critical variable is not whether it comes out. It's who controls the framing when it does." Kael'thas looked at Chu with visible interest. "You've modeled this." "Since Voss brought me in," Chu said. "The good scenario is a managed, honest disclosure that reframes the narrative before it can be weaponized. The bad scenario is anything reactive." "What does the good scenario require?" Kael'thas asked. Voss answered. "It requires TGA leadership to know. Not all of them. Not immediately. But the right people. People who can shape how this is presented to the public and to the broader galactic community." She looked at the ambassador. "It also requires something that has not existed in any form between our species." "A formal partnership," Kael'thas said. "Not a question. A formal partnership," Voss confirmed. "Transparent. Documented. With defined terms that acknowledge what the Veil have contributed without framing it as control. The story becomes, the Veil saw something in humanity worth investing in, they provided support during a critical developmental period, and now that relationship matures into an acknowledged alliance between equals." She let that sit for a moment. "It's a better story than the one you've been telling. And unlike the one you've been telling, it can survive scrutiny." Kael'thas was quiet for 12 seconds. Voss had given up counting. "The Veil High Council will require significant persuasion," the ambassador said at last. 300 years of operational methodology does not change without internal resistance. "I'm not asking you to change the methodology for other species," Voss said. "I'm asking you to change it for ours. Because our species specifically, for reasons you've already explained to me, is the one that functions better when it knows what it's fighting for." She held Kael'thas's gaze. "You invested in us because we're resilient under catastrophic pressure. I'm telling you that we're also substantially more effective when we're operating with full information. You've been giving us half of what made us worth investing in." Something shifted in Kael'thas's expression. More visible this time. Something that Voss thought might be, in Veil terms, the equivalent of being surprised to be impressed. "That argument," Kael'thas said slowly, "will be considerably more difficult for the Council to dismiss than any I have previously offered." "Good," Voss said. "Because I'm also going to make it to them directly." She watched the ambassador. "I want a meeting with the Veil High Council. I want to make this case myself. And I want Dr. Chu with me." Kael'thas tilted her head to the left. "You understand," she said, "that no human has ever addressed the Veil High Council in its full session." "I understand. You understand that 300 years of institutional practice will be arrayed against your proposal." "I understand that too. And you believe you can be persuasive." Voss considered this for a moment. She thought about all the things humanity had been told it could not do, and all the ways it had done them anyway, and all the ways it had been quietly helped to do them by beings now sitting across a table from her. I believe, she said, that I can give them an argument they haven't heard. And I believe that beings who have spent 300 years watching civilizations fail because the wrong information was withheld from the wrong people at the wrong time will recognize an honest case when they hear one. Calethris looked at her for a long moment. Yes, the ambassador said at last. I believe they will. The Veil home system was called Ethos by the Veil themselves, a word that translated closest to the place that endures. It was a binary star system, two amber suns that moved around each other in a slow, gravitational conversation that had been ongoing for 6 billion years. Voss arrived aboard a Veil diplomatic vessel, accompanied by Chu and Calethris. The journey took 19 days. She spent them reading, preparing, and walking the ship's observation corridor in the hours when sleep would not come. The other Veil crew members treated her with a careful courtesy that told her they knew who she was and what she was here for. No one was unfriendly. No one was warm. They watched her with the patient attention of people who had learned that the interesting things in the universe revealed themselves on their own schedule. She had submitted her formal address in writing 3 days before arrival. It had been reviewed, she was told, by 7 members of the council before the formal session was scheduled. The council chamber was not what she had expected. She had expected grandeur. What she found was a room that prioritized function over display. Curved walls. Tiered seating. Good acoustics. The 12 members of the Veil High Council sat in a semicircle that was positioned so that whoever addressed them was not elevated or diminished. They sat at the same level. Eye to eye. Voss stood at the floor of the chamber and looked at 12 beings who had, collectively, been involved in galactic politics for longer than human civilization had possessed writing. She was not afraid. She was aware of the scale of the moment, but fear had been replaced, somewhere on the 19-day journey, with something she could only describe as clarity. She began without notes. I am going to tell you what I think has happened, she said. And then I am going to tell you what I think needs to happen next. And I am going to make this argument not as a diplomat because I am not primarily a diplomat, but as someone who has spent 31 years studying how large, complex systems succeed and fail under pressure. She looked along the row of council members. They were still. Attentive. You created a methodology to help young civilizations survive their critical developmental periods, she said. The methodology is sound. The data supporting it is compelling. The alternative, which is watching capable civilizations destroy themselves while you have the tools to help, is genuinely worse. I am not here to argue that the methodology is wrong. I am here to argue that it has a flaw. She paused. The flaw is not the secrecy itself. The flaw is that the secrecy is time-limited in a way you may have underestimated. Every civilization you have assisted will eventually develop the analytical capacity to reconstruct what happened. The data does not disappear. The patterns remain. And when a civilization reaches the developmental stage where it can begin to see those patterns, what you have is a crisis. Not a managed transition. A crisis. Because the discovery comes without framing, without context, and into a political environment that is entirely unprepared for it. One of the council members, an elder Veil whose amber plating had gone pale with age, leaned forward slightly. You are suggesting that our method fails at the transition point. I am suggesting, Voss said, that your method was designed without a transition point. You've been operating as though the secret was permanent. It never was. It was always temporary. And temporary secrets without exit strategies become crises. The chamber was very quiet. What I am proposing is that you redesign the methodology with a built-in transition, she continued. A point at which the assisted civilization is formally acknowledged as a partner rather than a patient. A point at which the relationship is restructured with transparency and mutual consent. Not disclosure as a crisis response. Disclosure as a developmental milestone. She looked at the pale-plated elder who had spoken. Your civilization has survived for 6,000 years because you made better long-term decisions than most. I'm asking you to make one more. Acknowledge that the Terran Galactic Authority has reached the transition point. Partner with us openly. Let us help you redesign the methodology for others in a way that includes the transition from the beginning. The silence held for several seconds. You are asking us, said another council member, a younger Veil with deep copper plating, to allow a civilization that has been operating for less than 100 years to contribute to a methodology developed over 3 centuries. Yes, Voss said. Why do you believe your civilization has something to contribute that we lack? Voss considered the question for a moment. She thought about the Meridians and the Karathi and the Keth ascendancy. She thought about what had made them fail. Because, she said carefully, every civilization in your records that collapsed from within. Not from external force. From internal disconnection. From a growing gap between what the leadership knew and what the people experienced. From decisions made in the absence of honest information flowing in both directions. She met the copper-plated counselor's gaze. The Veil have survived because your biology gives you something most species lack. An emotional feedback system that makes it structurally difficult to abstract the consequences of your decisions. You feel the echoes. She paused. We don't have that. But we've built something that partially compensates for it. Systems of accountability, transparency, and public pressure that function as a kind of institutional substitute. We're not as naturally inclined toward honesty as you are. But we've developed external structures to compensate for that. She let that sit. What we have, she said, is experience designing systems to manage the gap between what leadership knows and what the public needs to know. That experience is exactly what your methodology needs at the transition point. She let a breath go. We are not asking to take over. We are asking to be genuinely useful. Which is, if I understand correctly, what you hoped for when you started this. The Veil High Council deliberated for 6 days. Voss and Chu were housed in comfortable quarters near the council complex and given access to the Veil Public Archive and unrestricted movement within the surrounding district. It was, Voss understood, both hospitality and observation. The Veil were watching how they moved through an unfamiliar space. How they treated the beings they encountered. What questions they asked. She asked a lot of questions. Mostly of the junior archivists and the maintenance staff and the workers she encountered in the corridors between the accommodation wing and the public gardens. The people whose opinions would not factor into any official deliberation but whose sense of the world was in some ways more valuable for exactly that reason. She learned that the Veil were not universally enthusiastic about the Council's long-term intervention program. There was a significant school of thought, particularly among younger Veil, that the methodology was paternalistic in ways that reflected an older era's assumptions about development and maturity. There was debate. Not loud debate because the Veil tended to process disagreement through resonance network rather than public argument, but genuine, serious debate. She found that encouraging. On the morning of the 7th day, Caelthris came to find her in the public garden. It was early. The binary suns were both below the horizon and the sky was a deep, layered blue-violet that Voss thought was the most beautiful thing she had seen in years. The council has reached a determination, Caelthris said. Voss stood up from the bench where she had been sitting. She waited. The proposal is accepted in modified form, Caelthris said. The modifications are primarily structural. They concern the pace of disclosure and the mechanism for the formal partnership transition. She paused. The Council has agreed that your argument regarding the transition flaw in the methodology is correct. This was not a unanimous conclusion, but it was a sufficient one. Voss let out a slow breath. What does the modified form look like? A joint working group, co-chaired by a Veil strategic analyst and a TGA representative of your choosing, will develop the transition framework. The formal disclosure to TGA senior leadership will occur within 18 months. Under conditions jointly designed by both parties to maximize framing stability. Caelthris looked at her. You will not be able to control everything. Political turbulence is likely regardless. But the narrative will be prepared and the counterarguments anticipated. What about the broader methodology? For other species. The working group will also address that. With the understanding that what is being designed is a template, not a universal prescription. Different civilizations will require different approaches. Caelthris paused. You will not have authority over decisions regarding species that are not the TGA. But your analytical contributions will be formally incorporated. Voss nodded slowly. And the partnership itself? Will be announced simultaneously with the disclosure, Caelthris said. So that the revelation of past assistance is immediately contextualized by a forward-looking partnership structure. Not, the Veil secretly managed humanity. But, the Veil supported humanity's development and that relationship now evolves into a formal alliance between sovereign civilizations. Voss thought about that framing. It was better. Not perfect. Nothing about this was going to be perfect. There will be people, she said, who hear this and feel that everything humanity achieved was diminished by it. Yes, Caelthris said. And there will be people who feel that everything the Veil did was a violation regardless of the intent. Yes. And both of those responses are understandable. Yes, Caelthris said again. We have had this conversation internally for 300 years. We do not expect the external version to be simpler. Voss looked at the violet sky. The first of the twin suns was beginning to show at the horizon. The light was amber and very clean. What I keep coming back to, she said, is the Vale analyst who wrote that you act without consent and you accept responsibility for that choice. She turned to look at Caelthris. That is not the language of manipulation. That is the language of someone who made a difficult ethical decision with incomplete information and lived with the weight of it. 300 years is a long time to live with a weight, Caelthris said quietly. Yes, Voss said. It is. She paused. I don't think what you did was right. I think it was the least wrong available option given what you knew and when you knew it. Those are different things. They are. And I think you know that. And I think that's why you were waiting for someone who would ask the right questions instead of just demanding the right answers. Caelthris was quiet for a moment. The second sun joined the first at the horizon and the sky shifted from violet to a warm, layered gold. We have a phrase in the original Vale, the ambassador said. It does not translate precisely into any human language, but the closest rendering is something like, the garden does not know the gardener, but the gardener knows the garden, and the gardener's hope is the day the garden grows beyond the need for tending. Voss looked at her for a long time. Is that what this is? She asked. We do not know yet, Caelthris said. That is rather the point. They stood together in the garden as both suns rose, and neither of them spoke, because what was coming next was large enough that it did not require words to acknowledge it. It required time and work and honesty and the willingness to build something that neither species could build alone. Humanity had been shaped by forces it could not see. It had risen further and faster because of a hand it had not known was extended. Those facts would be hard. The history would have to be revised. The monuments would need new plaques. But the bones were real. The resilience was real. The will to reach the stars and plant something there that lasted was real. No one had invented that from outside. The Vale had provided conditions. The choices had been made in human hearts, in human governments, on human ships crossing the dark between stars. And now those same humans would sit at a table with the oldest civilization in the sector and contribute to something that had never existed before. A methodology of care that acknowledged its own imperfection and invited the people it cared for to help make it better. Admiral Sarah Voss stood in the garden of an alien world under two amber suns and thought that the galaxy was large and ancient and frequently ruthless and full of things that died before they reached their potential, and that this particular morning, on this particular world, at this particular moment in the long story of a species that had refused generation after generation to stop trying, felt like something worth the wait. Not a triumph. Not a vindication. Something more durable than either. A beginning.